On this day 4 years ago, a deal to restore Stormont was struck. How long will we have to wait to see the 2024 sequel? The chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee says it's time for courage from the DUP.
The time has come for intellectual, cerebral unionism. Muscular unionism will only take you so far.
Plus, if Gerry Kelly wanted to protect his good name, why didn't he take action against Jim Allister 13 years ago?
You chose to be a terrorist, Mr. Kelly. You chose to be a terrorist. You chose to plant a bomb. You chose to shoot a prison officer in the head. No one made you do it. You chose to do it.
Let Gerry Kelly have his right of reply.
I am not blaming him on what I did. He is right. I made my decisions.
Are some Sinn Féin members now using the courts in Dublin and Belfast to intimidate their critics? We'll get the picture from both sides of the border. Hello, it's now more than 3 weeks since Chris Heaton-Harris called time on the negotiations to restore Stormont. The deal was done and the time for talking was over. So where are we now? The chair of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, Sir Robert Buckland, says he's a committed unionist, and tonight he's issued a stark warning to the DUP. I spoke to him a short time ago.
Look, I'm sensitive about my role. I'm a committee chair. I represent all parties in Parliament, and I don't want to put my hobnail boots through any process. I certainly, of course, continue to talk to DUP colleagues. They know my view is, my personal view, is that I want to see the Executive and the Assembly back as soon as possible. I understand that the issue remains relating to the protocol and its operation in Northern Ireland. But as I keep on saying, let's concentrate, and it's particularly important for politicians in Stormont to concentrate on what is directly within their control. And that is a swathe of devolved issues, from health to education to transport to all those other public services that need to be delivered now. And that's why I think focusing on what is achievable and what is within their direct control would be the best way forward.
There is, of course, a £3.3 billion package on the table, which the government has described as a generous offer. Is it, in your view, generous?
Well, I don't like words like generous. I think they imply, a sort of master and servant arrangement, which isn't how people should view the government or politics or the people of Northern Ireland. It's a big offer. It's considerably bigger, even taking into account inflation, than offers we've seen in the past. And it contains real hope on public sector pay, nearly £600 million. But importantly, it should be tied to fiscal responsibility and a plan for that fiscal responsibility that offers the chance of wiping out that overspend that, of course, hangs over the Executive and which has to be dealt with.
So you're talking about revenue raising?
Well, of course there has to be. Look, any responsible government, and that includes government in Stormont, not only spends money, but it needs to account for that money and to make sure that it's balancing the books. That's what governments across the world do. That's what I want to see happening in Stormont, talking about the issues that matter to people, the bread and butter issues of health, education and public services and the economy, rather than constitutional issues that we all know are the province of either negotiators from the UK government or indeed, in the case of the protocol, the EU.
So you've already said you don't like the language that the government has used. You don't like the word generous. You think it smacks of a master-servant relationship. The other factor, of course, is the fact that the government says that money, that £3.3 billion, is dependent on the return of Stormont. Isn't that, at its simplest, a crude form of blackmail?
Well, you could call it that. I don't. I call it realism. I think it's right that the government says, look, we want to make this offer, but we need to see government back in Stormont. And it's no good perpetuating the master-servant relationship by keeping on looking to Westminster and to the Northern Ireland office and the government in the UK to bail out the situation, to settle up with public sector workers, for example, tempting though that may be. That shouldn't be the job of the British government. That's the job of the government of Northern Ireland and its politicians.
But if its politicians aren't prepared to go back into government because the DUP is refusing to reverse its boycott and because the other parties can't go in without that happening, Then there is a hiatus. The wheels are coming off the truck, if they haven't already come off the truck. There is a big strike happening next Thursday as things stand. Surely under those circumstances, it is the responsibility of the UK government to do what needs to be done to make sure that Northern Ireland stays afloat.
Well, look, I think the UK government is very sensitive to all of this and has, in its direct legislation and in its rollover budgets, done that. But, you know, they quite rightly don't want to trespass into areas that are properly the province of the government of Northern Ireland. You know, if the UK government starts doing that unilaterally, that raises all sorts of issues about the Good Friday Northern Ireland process, Strand 2 in particular, and all sorts of complications start to emerge that I think we can all do without. Whilst it's easy, I think, to point fingers across the Irish Sea, either east or west, I think it's time to stop doing that, and it's time to come to this with clean hands, to get the executive and the assembly going and to get on with the business of government. It's the basic hygiene of government in Northern Ireland that we need to concentrate on now, and that's why it's up to the politicians in Northern Ireland to do just that.
But you will understand that the government's refusal to settle public sector wage disputes is what's causing the strike action. And the argument is that if Stormont's not back and Stormont can't do that because of the action or the inaction of the DUP, then it falls to the UK government to come up with the money, which is sitting on the table. And if the government's not prepared to do that, then people will interpret that as pressure being brought to bear on workers in Northern Ireland. And that is something which, of course, may help the government to persuade the DUP to come back in again. So it's a bit of a triangular relationship, is it not?
Well, it's tempting to look at it like that. I think on one level it's maybe a cynical view about how the UK government would view the valued contribution that public service workers make in Northern Ireland. I don't think that's their position, but the reality is this, facing us, all of us as elected politicians have responsibilities to face up to. Sometimes we have to make decisions that we don't particularly like. We don't live in a perfect world. The DUP are part of this imperfect world. There isn't a perfect solution for them, but there is a solution, and a solution that can deliver for their constituents, many of whom are public service workers, in a way that I think would redound to their credit. And that's why I think now it is the time for leadership, for courage, if you like, an overused word sometimes, but one that perhaps might apply in this case, to allow the executive to be formed as quickly as possible, to settle the strikes, and to get on with the business of government.
A lot of people are saying that this is Jeffrey Donaldson's David Trimble moment, just as the then leader of the Ulster Unionist Party had to take a very big decision about the way forward for unionism back in 1998. Is the time now right for Sir Jeffrey Donaldson to make the same kind of big call? Is that what it comes down to?
Well, it's tempting, isn't it, for politicians to try and assess their legacy before they actually write the pages of history. But there are moments in the politics of Northern Ireland when people have made big steps, and not just the late, great David Trimble, who I knew and loved dearly, but Dr Paisley himself made that big step forward with Martin McGuinness not 15 or so years ago. And there are moments where I think one has to not just move with the tide, but make the weather. And I very much hope that Jeffrey will be able to do that. And I think history will be very kind to him if he does.
The SDLP leader, Colm Eastwood, meantime, says if the DUP doesn't end its Stormont boycott very soon, it'll be time for the Dublin government to have a greater say in the affairs of Northern Ireland. Is it now time, Sir Robert, to start to think about what Plan B might look like?
Well, look, I think Colm Eastwood makes quite an interesting point about the potential effects of what British-Irish cooperation would look like at a governmental level if indeed the British government was tempted to, in effect, try and rule Northern Ireland directly in a way that we haven't seen in many a year. We all know what that would mean in terms of triggering certain aspects of the Good Friday Agreement. It would mean cooperation and involvement of the Irish government ultimately. I think that we can avoid that scenario, which I don't think either London or Dublin wants to see, frankly, by making sure that colleagues in Northern Ireland, the directly elected politicians there who are not working in the way that they should, work in the way that they should. We can avoid all this by making sure that the principal strand of the Good Friday Agreement is working, which is that executive and assembly in Stormont.
That, with the greatest respect, sounds like a pretty dire warning directed at the DUP, a shot across the party's bows. You are saying, if I understand you correctly, that old-style direct rule of the past is not on the table in future if Stormont doesn't come back. That's it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Well, I think so. And I think anybody who, like many of us will have remembered and read and some committed parts of the process, the Good Friday Belfast Agreement to memory, will know that there's no going back to the previous dispensation. That would be to upend 26 years of progress. And that's what's at stake here. That's why we created this particular mechanism. That's why the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister share power together with the principal parties of Northern Ireland in Stormont. That's the opportunity that awaits Sir Geoffrey and friends in the DUP, and indeed Sinn Féin as well. And I very much hope that if I'm back before you in February, we're in a new era.
And just finally on this one, you are someone who styles yourself as a unionist, and you say that you're friendly with unionists in Westminster. What is your message to those people who say their unionism is very precious to them, maybe watching this programme tonight, who are worried about the move that Sir Geoffrey Donaldson might make, who are concerned about the subjugation of Northern Ireland to the European Union under the terms of the Windsor Framework, who are concerned that accepting the deal on the table could hasten the end of the union, who feel that very strongly and who use language like sellout. How have they got it wrong? How would you try to persuade them tonight that they've got it wrong and you've got it right?
Look, I'm a unionist of deep conviction. All my adult life I've been a unionist. In fact, I first got elected as a councillor in Wales as a Conservative and unionist. That's how much I care about it. But I think the time has come for intellectual, cerebral unionism. Muscular unionism will only take you so far. Let's think deeply about why it is that the people of Northern Ireland value the United Kingdom. It's because of quality public services like our National Health Service. That's, I think, what we've got to remember here. When we look at the lived experience of communities in Northern Ireland, they, I think, deserve to see important UK public services being delivered to them. And the more that we allow the situation to atrophy, the more we endanger that union. And it's time, therefore, to think and to stop and think about what it means to erode the sort of public services that have been the hallmark of the quality of life that being part of the United Kingdom has offered, I believe, and should still offer many communities in Northern Ireland.
I just wonder, Sir Robert, if that argument carries the weight today that it did a number of years ago. You talk about the quality of public services here and elsewhere across the UK being one of the main selling points of the union. You quote the National Health Service. We've got horrendous waiting lists in Northern Ireland at the moment. They outstrip anything in England, Scotland and Wales. We've got real problems within education. We've got real problems within infrastructure. And in fact, your committee's been looking at the current state of public services in Northern Ireland recently. I just wonder if you can give us a flavour of the committee's conclusions. What are they likely to be? There's no way you can say they're as good today as they were 5 or 10 years ago.
No, and without revealing those formal conclusions, the evidence that we've received shows clearly that per capita spending in Northern Ireland isn't where I think and the committee thinks it should be. And that's having an effect on not just the day-to-day funding of public services, but the ability of public services to plan ahead. And all those organisations, those charities and other organisations that do so much to help deliver services, whether it's services to disabled people or children with autism or particular needs, are all suffering because of this inability to plan ahead. And that's why the argument about public services and their quality is, in my view, one of the central arguments about the value of the union. And putting aside the politics of unionism and nationalism, it's sheer political basic hygiene to get the delivery of public services right, to cut the sort of backlogs that we're seeing in Northern Ireland, indeed in Wales, my home country as well, it's pretty bad, to see that post-COVID effect reduced, and to get on with the business of delivering for the communities. And that's why I think our report, although it's not yet ready, we're waiting to see what happens with the outcome of the talks, our report will reveal some pretty stark facts about how much work needs to be done to recover lost ground.
Sir Robert Buckland speaking to me earlier. By the way, we did ask the Secretary of State and the DUP leader to join us on the programme tonight. Chris Heaton-Harris declined and Jeffrey Donaldson didn't come back to us. But let's get some analysis of what Sir Robert had to say and discuss the latest intelligence from the local parties. The Belfast Telegraph's Suzanne Breen and the Newsletter's Ben Lowry join me now. Welcome to both of you. Let's just talk about what Sir Robert Buckland had to say. First of all, Ben Lowry, it's time for intellectual and cerebral unionism. Muscular unionism only gets you so far. That's not going to play very well in some quarters, I'd have thought.
I don't think if unionists are unhappy with things that Sir Robert said, that would be the point. I think the point where unionists would be unhappy. He talked all the way through that rather like a government minister, by the way, which perhaps you don't expect from somebody in his role.
Which he was, of course, until relatively recently, but he isn't now.
He's a highly experienced politician, and he was talking about his unionism in Wales, and it was a very interesting interview. But he was making clear, essentially, that there would be, he seemed to be implying an increased role. I don't think he used the word increased for the Irish government. I wonder how helpful that is if he's calling himself a conservative and unionist. He must have noticed that unionists are under pressure from a lot of the media, under pressure from businesses. I don't see many businesses expressing much concern about the Irish sea border, under pressure from the Irish government, from the American government, from the UK government. When there's genuine worry about a really serious issue, the Irish sea border manifested in the protocol, the Windsor Framework, that he's now talking about the Irish government, and also in a way that was inaccurate, because I think it was inaccurate. He seemed to say that since the Belfast Agreement, you couldn't have direct rule. That seemed to be the implication of what he was saying. But then he was talking about the restoration in 2007, which, as he said, wasn't that long ago, after 5 years of direct rule under a Labour government, which reclaimed sovereignty against the protests of the Irish government. So I think that part of the interview won't have pleased people.
Suzanne, what he definitely said was that if direct rule comes back because Stormont doesn't return, it will be a direct rule that is very different from the kind of government from Westminster that we've seen in the past, and there will be an enhanced role for Dublin. We've heard that before. Is that the threat of a stick to try to get Jeffrey Donaldson to sign up to the deal that he says is sitting there on the table? He said it's not a perfect solution, but there is a solution on the table.
I think it is very much a big stick that is being waved at Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP. Nationalists certainly will be demanding a greater enhanced role for Dublin if the talks that are ongoing at the moment don't work, if the DUP doesn't return to the executive, but I can't see it happening. What I see is the Secretary of State legislating for greater powers for civil servants to have some sort of maybe hybrid direct rule with some ministerial involvement from London, but I cannot see anything that resembles joint authority happening under this Tory government.
Well, what he did say was, just to quote him directly, we can avoid this scenario happening by making Stormont work. That's a direct quote.
And those words are for the ears of Jeffrey Donaldson and the DUP. It is to put the fear of God into them, but I don't think that it will work at the moment. The Tories, really, if the DUP don't go back to the executive, the Tories are going to take their foot off the pedal in terms of Northern Ireland. They're going to go for low involvement and just hope to keep it ticking over. They have far greater things on their plate. Very understandable understandably, nationalists do want an enhanced role for Dublin, but I don't think it's realistic. I think it's just wishful thinking.
OK, so let's see where we are at the moment at the beginning of 2024. We know that the Secretary of State has written to the 5 main parties and invited them to bilateral talks at Hillsborough next week. The invite says the meetings are to discuss ongoing efforts to restore the executive. So obviously the government hasn't given up. It's hoped that that is still doable at this stage. Ben, I mean, are you hearing anything at all that would suggest that there may be movement forthcoming, the kind of movement that some people were talking up before Christmas on the part of the DUP? Might it now happen in the new year?
At this exact moment in time, no. There was a momentum, or there seemed to be a momentum in December. And then there was that party officer meeting. This is the 12 most influential people, essentially, in the party. I think it was Friday, December the 15th. And I have tried to talk to people on what you could say a range of views in the party as to what happened in that meeting, and they're not saying. They're being very tight about what happened in that meeting. I would have thought that if there was a sustainable momentum to get this over the line, we would know about it by now. So I suspect, we can only really go week to week in this. I suspect that there won't be a deal this coming week, for example.
Well, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that nobody is talking this up at the moment, Suzanne. But we do know Jeffrey Donaldson has met officials in London recently. He's received some further clarification. He met his party officers today. What are you hearing about what might be happening in the undergrowth?
Well, look, the Secretary of State has said that the negotiations are over. He said that before Christmas. That sentiment has been repeated this week by Lord Keane. He has said that it is purely clarification. I know other people that are close to the talks dispute that, and they say that there has been progress made. There have been changes that have come in the technical talks between the DUP and the government. From my sources within the DUP, I think that Sir Jeffrey Donaldson likely does have a majority to get a deal through in party officers, but it's a very, very slim majority. It's a bare majority. It would be 7-5, and I think that he would be very, very cautious about progressing with that. He wants it to be much more comfortable to him. This is his Trimble moment. He, of all people, he knows the trouble that followed David Trimble when he signed up to a deal taking a bare majority of his party with him. Jeffrey Donaldson doesn't want that experience. He wants to be able to put on his sash and march in the 12th and not be called a Lundy. He doesn't want all that hassle. So he is by nature cautious, and David Trimble's experience is going to reinforce that for him.
Can I just ask you quickly about his MLA team? That Assembly team, as we understand it, the DUP Assembly team, is obviously keen to get back in again, because if it gets back in again, there's work to be done and the salaries will go back to normal. Is MLA pay an issue for Jeffrey Donaldson, do you think?
I think MLA pay is a big issue. I know that MLAs have raised it with Jeffrey Donaldson. I mean, this week I spoke to one unionist MLA that I thought would have been hardline, that would have said, don't go back to Stormont until we get all that we are asking for. And they surprised me. They said that the pay cut of 27.5% was really affecting them and affecting their family. And they said that they didn't see the wisdom of the DUP continuing to stay out of Stormont because they didn't think the government was going to give anything else. And I think there is resentment among some MLAs that the people that are stopping this deal, it's the MPs, and they have nice big fat salaries that continue regardless of progress.
I think our team's been hearing similar things as far as MLA pay is concerned as well. Can I ask you, Ben, about next week's strike action? This day next week, we could well be reporting on, the most significant day of strike action effectively in the history of Northern Ireland. So many people in public sector involved in that. Is that not potentially very dangerous for those who oppose this deal? Because there will be people who will say it is their responsibility. If they went back in, the £3.3 billion package would be delivered by the UK government. They stay out, it's not.
There's no doubt that this makes things more difficult for the DUP. I mean, I think the DUP will be relieved that many union leaders have been putting the pressure on the UK government, which is where the DUP would say that it would be. But of course, the timing of this is difficult for them. I do want to come back just a little bit, because that was such an important point you were talking there about MLA pays. My goodness, it would be lamentable if unionists, their principal concern was MLA pay. That sort of issue isn't the concern, is never the sort of thing that's going to change Sinn Féin on a core goal goals such as an Irish Language Act. And this is a much more important issue, unionists would say constitutional issue, than anything like that. But one thing I would say about a return, and this is something I've said for months, and this is me looking in from the outside. You never really know what's going on unless you're in the inside. But my looking in very closely from the outside, I just can't see a return without a rupture. I just can't. I don't know what the rupture will be, but the idea that there will be a return in which there is no public dissent, I don't know whether people will leave the party. Maybe. I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, there are people who are very opposed to this. And as Suzanne was saying, they're not small in number. And they include MLAs. But obviously there is naturally, amongst MLAs, some sort of desire to get back that's going to be greater than people in Westminster. But as I say, it would be wrong to trivialise that.
Suzanne, just one final question, briefly, if you would. There was a little bit of speculation that Emma Little-Pengelly could get the nod for Deputy First Minister if and when Stormont comes back. Are you hearing that maybe it's not as cut and dried as some people were suggesting it might be?
Well, Emma Little-Pengelly is someone who's been hugely promoted by Jeffrey Donaldson, and we all know why. She is a good media performer, she's smart, she is articulate, but there is a section of MLAs who don't like her. They didn't like her when she was a special advisor, they didn't like her when she was MP, and I am hearing resistance to the idea that if a deal is done, she could be Deputy First Minister. An MLA said to me, Emma is not going to be the boss of me. So there is resistance there, and the question would be whether that would be something that Jeffrey Donaldson would seek to compromise on in order to bring more of the party with him, or will he hold firm, because he really does rate and respect her.
OK, well, we'll find out. Maybe we won't in due course. We'll leave it there for now. Thank you both very much indeed. Next to one of the other big stories this week, the libel action brought by the senior Sinn Féin MLA Gerry Kelly against the journalist and author Malachy O'Doherty. Mr Kelly had sought damages over 2 radio interviews given by Dr O'Doherty in which he stated Mr Kelly had shot a prison officer during the Maze escape in 1983. The judge in the High Court throwing the case out described it as scandalous, frivolous and vexatious. In the ruling, he said it was more likely that the action had been brought by Mr Kelly not to vindicate an injured reputation, but rather for the purpose of stifling the voices of his troublesome critics. We'll be talking about this latest example of what many see as a deliberate tactic by Sinn Féin politicians in a moment. But first, watch this exchange between Gerry Kelly and the TUV leader Jim Allister from a BBC political debate back in 2010.
This is a man who bombed the Old Bailey and 1 man died. This is a man who shot a prison officer in the head. He is a victim maker. You chose to be a terrorist. You chose to plant a bomb. You chose to shoot a prison officer in the head. No one made you do it.
Well,
you chose to do it.
Let Gerry Kelly have his right of reply.
I am not blaming him on what I did. He is right. I made my decisions.
Do you regret it?
What I'm trying to say to
Do you regret
let me finish.
shooting a prison officer in the head? Do you regret planting a bomb in the Old Bailey?
You have to let him speak.
What I'm trying to get him to understand is that if you're a Republican, right, and your son or daughter was killed, then you hurt as well. And there is no idea of taking that attitude. And that's dinosaur politics.
Well, Suzanne is still here, and we've been joined in studio by the Irish Times Northern editor Freya McClements, and from Dublin by Virgin Media News political correspondent Gavin Riley. Welcome to all of you. Jim Allister, Suzanne, states 3 times that Gerry Kelly shot a prison officer in the head in that extract that we have shown. Mr Kelly had the opportunity to rebut and he didn't, yet 9 years later Malachy O'Doherty says the same thing and Gerry Kelly takes a defamation action against him. Why?
Well, that is the big question. You would have thought if damage is done to someone's reputation that they would take action immediately. I have to say I was hugely surprised that Gerry Kelly was taking a libel action against Malachy O'Doherty on this issue. I mean, about 30 years ago, I sat in the Felons Club on the Falls Road as a journalist, and I heard Gerry Kelly talk with Bobby Storey and Robert Goose Russell about the Great Escape. Things were said. during that debate. And certainly Jerry Kelly was not distancing himself from anything that happened during it. If he had, he would have been chased from the felons. But I mean, he wouldn't have wanted to. So I'm surprised that he took this libel action, knowing that he had in the past said the things he said, didn't say the things he said, and that things were written about him. Libel is a high wire act, and there's a lot at stake, and you really, really have to have all your ducks in the row and have a concrete case.
He is distancing himself from that incident tonight. We asked Mr. Kelly a series of questions, including why he didn't rebut Mr. Allister's charge at the time during the programme back in 2010, or subsequently take action against Mr. Allister or the BBC. Now, he didn't answer our questions in full, but he did give us a 3-line statement, which I'm going to read in full. He said, "My involvement as a combatant in the conflict has long been a matter of public record. I've also worked for more than 30 years to build and consolidate the peace process, been involved in most of the key negotiations with the governments and political parties, and been elected by the people of North Belfast to public office for the last 28 years. For the record, I did not shoot the prison officer during the 1983 mass escape of political prisoners from the H blocks of Long Kesh." Freya, what do you make of that?
Yeah, well, I think, again, as Suzanne said, the interesting question here is why has he waited until now to distance himself from this, when we've heard that there, and much of this was discussed in the judgment, he's had many opportunities to do so prior to now, and he hasn't done so. And it's notable in the judgment, and the Master makes this point, that it's difficult to discern any valid reason why he took this action. And the judge goes on to say, this bears the hallmarks of a slap. This strategic lawsuit against public participation initiated, the judge said, not for the genuine purposes of vindicating one's good name, but instead from stifling dissent from bothersome journalists. So what this does is this raises these questions again about whether or not there is this policy by high-profile members of Sinn Féin of taking actions such as these for that purposes. I mean, something that Sinn Féin has roundly and repeatedly denied, but nevertheless these criticisms have been made, and those criticisms persist.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out that there have been cases that Sinn Féin members have taken and have been successful in the courts with. Gavin, this is an issue on both sides of the border, of course, and Freya is quite right to say that Sinn Féin figures, senior Sinn Féin figures, including Michelle O'Neill and Pearse Doherty, have said there's no Sinn Féin strategy to try to silence the party's critics. They've said these cases are taken on an individual basis. And, of course, we've had the Business Post newspaper in the Republic reporting today that the Sinn Féin press office has said the party will not be paying Mr Kelly's legal costs in this case. Does that apparently relaxed approach to members deciding to take legal cases ring true for a party with such a reputation for centralised control, north and south of the border?
It might well be the case, Mark, that there isn't a deliberate strategy of taking legal actions, whether they be with justification or whether they be vexatious. But there is definitely a culture. I mean, as you quite rightly say, that ruling out members of Sinn Féin who've served in public office north side of the border. When you look at those in the Republic, for example, there's been cases where Angus O'Snuddick has successfully taken a case against the Sunday World, settled in his favour. Pearse Doherty and Mary Lou MacDonald have both previously taken cases against the Irish Examiner, which were settled in their favour. Donegal O'Leary, the Sinn Féin TD, took a case against RTE and Joe Duffy, the broadcaster, in 2020 because he was wrongly identified on air as having been previously a member of the IRA and having served convictions for that membership. One might say, in passing, by the by, that it would be curious that a Sinn Féin member would believe that his good name might be tarnished by association with the IRA, when in fact Donegal O'Leary sits in the benches in Dáil Éireann alongside people like Desi Ellis, who have convictions for serving in the IRA and for terrorist incidents. And by the way, Mary Lou MacDonald has previously had a case settled in her favour over comments made online by the Fianna Fáil TD, the then Fianna Fáil TD, Declan Branagh. But there might not be a strategy, but yet clearly the culture is there. And one notable aspect of some of the cases that have been taken by Sinn Féin officials in the South is that sometimes the case is taken without there being any obvious instigation for follow-up afterwards, by which I mean that the paperwork to initiate the case might be filed in the High Court, but that the Sinn Féin figures might be quite slow, if indeed they ever get around to filing any affidavits to basically put some meat on the bones of their case. For example, again, Matt Carthy, who's now Sinn Féin's foreign affairs spokesperson in Dublin, in 2018, I believe, filed a High Court case against a Fianna Fáil member, Ken McFadden, over comments that were made online. To this day, there has never been an affidavit sworn in the courts by either side to either give some succour to that case or to have it dismissed. So you might say, and I know that this is certainly the feeling among some members of the press corps in Leinster House, that merely initiating these cases almost brings down the veil, where Sinn Féin can say certain aspects can't be discussed because they're notionally sub judice, when in fact the cases don't ever go anywhere, because Sinn Féin members can be quite slow, if ever, actually going about trying to initiate a hearing in those instances.
Yeah, I should also make the point that when I spoke to Mary Lou McDonald about this towards the end of last year after her party's Ardèche, she made the point that it's not just Sinn Féin members who are taking cases like this. Representatives, members of other parties have also taken libel and defamation cases against individuals in the past and continue to do so. I wanted to just bring in Freya again and make the point, because I think it's important, that your newspaper, the Irish Times, and a member of the paper's political staff is currently involved in a case with a Sinn Féin TD. Yeah,
absolutely. So this involves my colleague Harry McGee, our political correspondent, and an action that was initiated in November by the TD, Chris Andrews, off the back of an article that Harry had written. It was looking at Chris Andrews claimed that he was defamed in an article that was about Sinn Féin's response to the Hamas attack in Israel. And again, one of the tendencies that we've seen with these is to take the action against a named journalist rather than, as would normally have been the case in the past, against the media organisation, against the named journalist in particular. The Irish Times is defending this rigorously and is fully supporting Harry in this. But I think one of the things that this has done, and we've seen this in the wake of the case this week involving Jerry Kelly and Malachy O'Doherty, is that it has put this question of press freedom in the spotlight. It's put this question of the chilling effect that this has on journalism into the spotlight. And I think one of the things that we will see going forward is when we're looking at changes to the Defamation Act in the North and the defamation bill that's going through the Dáil in the South, this is absolutely on the agenda as part of that.
Suzanne, we will step our way through this very carefully for obvious reasons, but you yourself, I'm not quite sure if I should say are or have been involved in a case with Sinn Féin. Is that still an active case? How would you describe it at the moment?
Yes, there are issues that are still being sorted out by the courts, but there was a libel action taken against myself and against Sunday Life over a column that I wrote. There was a picture of the Sinn Féin Christmas party in Newry, and some of the article concerned the murder of Paul Quinn, who was killed by the IRA, and as a result of the article, proceedings were issued against myself and against the paper. We defended that rigorously, and the libel claim was dismissed by the High Court in Dublin late last year. Obviously, as a journalist, when you're being personally sued, not just the outlet that you work for, there is a lot of pressure on you, and I think particularly so in terms of Malachy O'Doherty, who was a freelance journalist, not with the resources of a big company backing him, but he went the distance, he stayed the course, and he has been completely and utterly vindicated.
Gavin, just briefly, if you would, I'm not sure how this has been received or how this has been reported in the Republic. There's been a lot of interest in the Jerry Kelly case in Northern Ireland in the last few days, as you would understand. Is it likely to prompt a rethink on the part of senior members of Sinn Féin about how this issue is approached, or not, do you think?
Well, we certainly put it to Matt Carthy, who was giving a press conference about other issues today, and he gave the usual Sinn Féin response, which is that this is not a party issue. If this was a decision made on the initiative of Jerry Kelly himself, then strictly speaking, it has nothing to do with the party. So if that is the Sinn Féin position, and that is a position that they sincerely hold, one imagines they will keep to that point. One other point that's worth briefly making, though, when we talk about some of these cases in the South, is that there is, generally speaking, an established code of practice where if somebody has a complaint about something written in a newspaper, they can contact the Press Council and escalate a complaint through there. If they have an issue with something that's said on Virgin or RTE, they can go through the Broadcasting Commission. That often isn't done in the case of Sinn Féin. It is directly through the legal route.
OK, got to leave it there, folks. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on the programme tonight. That's it for tonight. Sunday Politics is back this weekend at the